Hi, everyone. I think we're still going to keep waiting for more people to trickle in, but I thought that I might as well introduce Elizabeth Frelkeld, the director of the Stimson Center's South Asia program, to give a few opening remarks before we begin the fellow presentations.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sunena. Thanks to all of you for joining us this morning, whether from the US, from South Asia, or elsewhere. A very good morning or good evening, depending on where you're coming from. It really is a pleasure to welcome you all to our capstone presentations of the 2021 Visiting Fellowship. This is one of my favorite days of the year here at Stimson because it really is the culmination of an effort that our whole team, our non-resident fellows, our amazing visiting fellows have put a lot into over the past year. What you're going to hear today are a range of different presentations from some of the up and coming thinkers from South Asia. We have 2 fellows from India, 2 from Pakistan. You'll hear introductions in a bit, but for my purposes, very briefly, I just wanted to introduce those of you to Stimson who aren't familiar with our work and to the Visiting Fellowship specifically. So Stimson was founded back at the end of the Cold War with an idea of trying to capture some of the lessons learned from the Cold War and apply them to emerging challenges down the road in other regions, in other issue areas. The South Asia program was founded soon after, so we're coming up on our own 30th anniversary. And for much of that time, we have been very fortunate to be able to welcome a range of visiting fellows from both India and Pakistan since the early 1990s under Michael Crapon. Looking back at that list of names, it's pretty astounding who has joined us here at Stimson, many of whom have gone on to senior positions in government, analysts, think tankers, and really just thought leaders across the and that's a legacy that we're proud of and that I am confident that our visiting fellows who are with us here today and have spent the last year working so hard will carry forward. So in terms of how the fellowship works and how it's evolved, I think key to that list is the fact that we're all sitting here virtually today. And that is not how any of us would like it, but under the circumstances with COVID, I've been very pleasantly surprised by how we've been able to adapt. Our 4 visiting fellows have joined us for 2 one-month periods over the course of this year and have done nearly 40 meetings with some of key US officials, academics, think tank analysts, all working in the South Asia space to get a feel for how DC views the region, how policymaking works here, and also to build relationships. This is fundamentally at its core an exercise in bridge building, not just between fellows from India and Pakistan, but also trying to really introduce some views from the region and voices from the region here in Washington, DC. It is associated with our flagship online publication, South Asian Voices, and all of our fellows have been prolific contributors to South Asian Voices, and we're glad to have been able to publish their work there and indeed to get to hear their longer form analysis that they will be presenting on today. So what you all are about to hear are research presentations that our fellows have been working on since January when they joined us remotely. They will go on to publish policy memos on the Stimson website, so be on the lookout for those. But I think today this really is an opportunity for them to get to hear your feedback, to answer some tough questions, to consider new angles of analysis that they haven't so far. So please do be jotting those down and keep them in mind so we can put our fellows on the hot seat and learn from them as best we can today. Before I turn things back over to Sunena, I really want to hit on some key thank yous. So first of all, to the fellows, I know this has been a difficult year of late nights given time differences in the region, but you all have done a really impressive job of working and being our fellows full time. So I know that's not easy. Thank you so much for all you've contributed over the past 9 months. This is also an all hands on deck effort for our team. So I really want to congratulate Sunena in particular as the lead of the Visiting Fellowship and the rest of our team as well, all of whom have pitched in to support this, to our non-resident fellows who have served as research mentors for our visiting fellows, and of course to our funders who have made this all possible. So we are very grateful. So today you are going to hear presentations on a range of topics, including opportunities for the Quad, the climate security nexus in Gilgit-Baltistan, potential for US-Pakistan tech cooperation, and India diaspora engagement and public diplomacy. So I think it is a packed program. And without further ado, I will hand things back over to Samina so we can get started. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you to everyone joining this morning or evening for those of you based out of South Asia. My name is Sunana Danziger. I am a research assistant with the Stimson South Asia program and also the deputy editor of South Asian Voices, which Elizabeth just described is our online publication featuring multinational perspectives on political security and economic issues within the subcontinent. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event and to introduce our 2021 visiting fellows. Kashif Hussain, Kashun Liza, Jyotsna Mehra, and Mohsin Putin Purayo. The fellows will be presenting their findings after 9 months affiliated with the Stimson Center's South Asia program. This research is still in progress and will feature in final form in Stimson published policy memos, very much the capstone of their fellowship. Presenting first will be Jyotsna Mehra, a New Delhi-based researcher and Pacific Forum young leader who will be presenting her findings on deliverables for the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. She will be followed by Kashif Hussain, a research associate at the Strategic Studies Institute Islamabad, who will present on the climate security nexus in Gilgit-Baltistan. Next, Kashun Liza, an advocacy and editorial specialist at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute, will present on opportunities for US-Pakistan cooperation in the tech and clean energy sectors. Finally, Mohsin Putin Purayo, a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Hyderabad, will discuss Indian public diplomacy and diaspora engagement. Each fellow will present for about 10 minutes, after which we will open up the floor for audience questions and discussion. Please leave any questions, and this is especially as the first few fellows are presenting, in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will try to get to as many as possible at the end of the presentations. I will ask the fellows to keep their answers to your questions brief so that we can get to as many as possible and have a fruitful discussion at the end. With that, I will turn it over to Jyotsna to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Sunana, and thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, good evening, everyone, and happy Diwali. For my policy brief, I'm outlining the agenda for the Quadrilateral Partnership of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. So before I start diving deeper into the areas I cover in my policy brief, I would like to talk briefly about the background on the subject and why I am developing an agenda for the Quad. So some things clearly stand out in the relatively short history of the Quad. Quad came together in 2004 in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. Then in 2007, there was some level of engagement among Quad officials and also a Malabar naval exercise together with Singapore. But just a year later, the Quad in a way died a quick death, largely considered to be a result of being seen as an anti-China bloc. And at the time, the group was not as much of a priority in the strategic calculi of these countries. But Quad was back almost a decade later in 2017, largely because the geopolitical outlooks on China and the Indo-Pacific had started aligning. And also because in that intervening decade, India was able to extensively expand its ties with its Quad partners. And today in 2021, we've seen 2 leaders summit and the 4 embracing the Quad robustly. I'm happy to go into the background further in the Q&A session, but the important point here is that the Quad has had an image problem that has for some time now limited its engagement. Some see the Quad as a hard security alliance sharply geared against China, and like I pointed out, this was one of the reasons why the Quad pulled the brakes on its partnership in 2008. Of course, this is incorrect. The Quad is not an alliance and it's not a hard security partnership. Some others see that the Quad is so misaligned that it can't really get much done. This criticism has largely surfaced in recent years, where critics have pointed out that the Quad is a talking shop and it's all about symbolism and less about substance. So now that the Quad has met again and it is meeting regularly, and this time around, the Quad countries' interests are increasingly aligned, the Quad needs an agenda to hold itself together, but also to deal with a variety of Indo-Pacific challenges. And that's what my policy brief seeks to do. The next slide shows you how shared outlook on the Indo-Pacific and China led to the rebirth of the Quad. The picture on the left, in some ways, shows the policy roots of the Indo-Pacific concept. Former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, delivering a speech in the Indian Parliament on the confluence of the two seas. Remember, this was around the time when the Quad had first started convening. The second picture comes from after the time the Quad was temporarily laid to rest in 2008. Again, this is from Shinzo Abe, who wrote a piece on proposing the Quad security diamond for security in Asia. He talks about the need to preserve freedom of navigation in light of Chinese activities in the region. Now, the next slide just highlights the fact that India on the top right and Japan on the bottom, top left and Japan on the bottom right, actually until very recently even shied away from using the word Quad in official communication. But now in 2021, all four, like I said, have embraced the Quad robustly. And we are seeing joint statements for the first time and even a co-authored piece by all four Quad leaders in Washington Post as shown here. Working groups have been established to deal with specific challenges. All this would have been unimaginable just a year ago. So now what lies next is identifying areas that the four can work on. If you look at the bigger picture, the overarching objective of the Quad is to learn to work together outside an alliance structure. So Australia and the United States and Japan and the US already have that experience. So Quad offers a platform for these countries to work together with India and iron out whatever differences that there may be. It's about meeting to develop habits of cooperation so that when the Indo-Pacific security environment complicates even further, the groundwork would have been done and a level of interoperability and familiarity achieved. The Quad would have worked with each other as partners of choice on a range of issues. So in that sense, maybe a formalized laundry list agenda may be quite limiting for the Quad, because one of the greatest strengths of the Quad is its flexibility, because with that comes some ambiguity which offers a degree of deterrence. There is a view in Quad capitals that since the Biden administration took over, the focus of the Quad has moved away from China to more global issues. But as you will see, all of the discussions around the agenda of the Quad still have a lot to do with China, even if the Quad does not explicitly say so, from vaccine diplomacy to emerging technology, 5G issues, defense and security, etc. So if we come to the actual policy brief and the deliverables I discuss, I have been discussing this with experts who are based out of all four Quad countries, and three broad baskets of cooperation have emerged: health, emerging technology, and defense and security. So broadly speaking, there are some deliverables within these baskets that would be more of low-hanging fruits than others. So if we go to the health area, vaccine initiative was announced by the Quad Leaders Summit recently in March 2021. So they're working along a division of labor model where US and Japan will fund vaccines made for the Indo-Pacific region by India, and Australia will be providing the last mile delivery support. But I propose that we can take the health cooperation beyond COVID, where various national public health agencies, departments of pharmaceuticals, departments of biotechnology, etc., maintain a regular contact to monitor and share information on emergence of new epidemics and establish an early warning alarm mechanism. The Quad has already set ambitious health security targets. They vowed to conduct one pandemic preparedness tabletop exercise next year. The Quad could also look at critical health supply chains, especially in the field of active pharmaceutical ingredients. Here, partners could include Singapore, UK, France, and Germany because they have particular expertise in this area. On technology, the Quad has worked on developing a statement of principles on technology design, development, and use. And this could form the foundation of agreed upon principles and a common narrative that the Quad could push at organizations that look at tech standards, such as the International Organization for Standardization, International Telecommunications Union, etc. It is at these organizations where China has a great influence and has been contributing to international standards greatly in recent years. Here, the Quad could work with the Democracy 10 or the D10 countries because they're also aiming to look at this issue. The Quad could also form a track 1.5
Sorry, everyone. I think that Jyotsna froze. We'll give it a couple of minutes to see if she just comes back. Otherwise, we might come back in 2 seconds.
I'm sorry, there was a glitch. Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. So there's also need, like I said, for the Quad to monitor security threats that could be posed by the use of emerging technologies. The Quad could work on finalizing emerging technologies related defense and intelligence cooperation agreements. These could be a part of the already existing defense arrangements, but also exist as standalone arrangements. Specifically on defense and security, the Quad has been discussing maritime domain awareness, but they could also look at underwater domain awareness. On MDA, there's a need to look at a cross-security approach involving stakeholders who look at fisheries and also blue economy objectives. On underwater domain awareness, the Quad's been conducting anti-submarine warfare exercises, but there could be talks on technology sharing on acoustic analysis capabilities, which are important for enhancing UDA. The Quad could engage other partners in various formats, but one of them could be the Malabar exercise, where the Quad could invite friendly navies as observers. India could consider opening the Andaman Nicobar Islands to friendly navies. And once the AUKUS tensions subside, perhaps countries like France, UK, Vietnam, Indonesia could be invited as observers. Another area, of course, is practicing logistics sharing agreements. All these 4 countries could put these agreements to use by allowing access to airfields and bases for refueling, crew rest, etc. However, this should become so frequent and routine and bureaucratic hurdles removed that this should not be a newsworthy event. It should be as basic as that, and the defense cooperation should take flight from here. So just to conclude, I'll go over a few recommendations that the Quad could consider at a later stage. These are to do with the slightly trickier areas of cooperation. One would be climate change. As you all know, there are varied climate targets which have been suggested by all these 4 countries. So straightforward policy coordination might not be feasible at this stage, but climate technology, of course, remains an area of consideration. On development partnership, it might be easier for the Quad to work together a way where they could work on different parts of projects, overcoming limitations of varied sets of rules and regulations. And India could consider joining the Blue Dot Network, which under the Trump administration, the US and Australia and Japan joined. On defense and security, intelligence sharing is one area, perhaps on a case-to-case basis, and this might already be happening. But another consideration could be forming a defense ministers forum at some stage. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, and feel free to reach out on my email if you have comments.
Thank you very much, Jyotsna. Just a reminder, please do send any questions that you have on individual fellows' presentations, just using that Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screens. I'm now happy to pass it over to Kashif for his presentation.
Thank you, Sunaina. Hi, everyone. Today, I'll be talking about regional challenges of climate change and prospects for conflict resolution. So the main focus of my study is the disputed and contested highlands of Himalayas, Karakoram, Hindu Kush, spanning from Gilgit-Baltistan to Ladakh and Aksai Chan to Jammu Kashmir. These highlands possess huge glacier bodies, which are considered to be the globe's 3rd pole, harboring more ice than anywhere outside the Arctic and Antarctica. They feed main rivers of the region, and almost 2 billion people across Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and China are directly or indirectly dependent on fresh waters of these depleting glaciers. About 15% of these glaciers have already melted since the 1970s, and if temperature is restricted to 1.5 degrees Celsius rise, 36% of the glaciers will have disappeared by 2100. The rise in temperature to 2 degrees Celsius will leave half of these glaciers melted, while as a result of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius rise, 2/3 of the ice will be lost. So increase in river flows is predicted through to 2060 and decline in stream flows from 2060 onwards. Changing conditions of the regional ice mass can significantly affect irrigation, agriculture, tourism, hydroelectricity, drinking water, catastrophic floods, and cross-border conflicts. There are shared river basins and potential conflicts, including Indus River Basin between Pakistan and India, where India is an upper riparian, Pakistan is a lower riparian state, and Kabul River Basin is there between Pakistan and Afghanistan. However, this basin is relatively less volatile. However, there is increasing and rising demand. And also River Brahmaputra is there, which is contested between China and India. So the more concerning is the disputed nature of these mountain communities, which I just mentioned, and especially post India's annexation of Kashmir's autonomous status and issuance of new political maps and declaration of the Union Territory of Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan has also issued its own understanding of same nature and understanding as of India. So things are escalating between these two countries, obviously, and also between China and India. These two countries are eyeball to eyeball in Ladakh and Aksai border. So this is the current state of affairs with climate and conflict in the region. And my next slide is about my focus on these mountain communities for being vulnerable to conflict and climate makes my study unique, and especially for its pivotal geographical position, massive concentration of glaciers, and great potential to generate harmony and economic activity. Pakistan administered Gilgit-Baltistan demands unequivocal attention and offers extraordinary challenges and opportunities alongside. The region could be an area of focus for regional and global actors to initiate steps to help foster a cooperative environment and direct energies towards mitigating impacts of climate change by undertaking sustainable development initiatives. So GB may offer to be a vibrant trade and transit hub and logistic hub given its central position between China, India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and also between being a connecting point to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And it has, given its possession of huge mass of glacier bodies and rivers and streams, it has capacity to generate thousands of megawatts of run-of-the-river eco-friendly hydroelectricity, which it offers. And also there are avenues of tourism and adventure sports, given the presence of, lofty mountains, lakes, and pastures and plateaus, and unique culture, archaeological sites, historical forts, and so forth. So despite all this, GB has problems and challenges largely due to geopolitics and harsh conditions. The majority of people lack access to basic human needs like clean drinking water, electricity, and housing. The haphazard urban development in cities like Gilgit and Sikardu without proper sewerage and drainage system has been adding to the climate hazards by causing water pollution and erosion. More alarmingly, during the harsh winters, the region faces on average 48 hours consecutive power cuts, and the people are forced to cut trees to fulfill their needs. The increase in average temperatures has reached to the level that some districts of GB have experienced forest fires this year, and there is a certain increase in the frequency of flash floods and landslide incidents across GB. So existence of the largest glacier and highest battleground, the Siachen Glacier in the region, and presence of forces and related military activities have been impacting the environment and added to both the impacts of warming on the glacier and chances of a direct confrontation. Now, this is the state of affairs of this mountain communities, specifically my case study, Gilgit-Baltistan. This brings my presentation to the most important slide, which is policy recommendations, of course. While it's extremely crucial to resolve disputes in order to put a joint effort, and more importantly, to avoid a catastrophe over these vital sources of fresh water, no international organization or power seems to be in a position to make any of these countries agree to give up their unilateral actions and initiate a negotiation process. So under the situation, I strongly recommend considering this entire territory spanning from Gilgit-Baltistan to Ladakh and Aksai to Jammu Kashmir a global environmental park. An area free from barriers of trade and transit and visas will certainly generate vibrant and cooperative environment, vibrant economic activity, and increase revenue generation for these regional countries. And while these regional countries will, take care of all financial and technical matters, the indigenous people from mountains should take lead. They should be empowered to undertake all these initiatives, including, including declaring means, including finding means and ways to declare this territory a global environmental park, and including conflict resolution and also climate action. And to that end, I recommend creation of new offices to work on simultaneously on conflict and climate under local governments. And the composition and structure of these new offices can later be discussed during Q&A session. And also the establishment of think tanks, which is very crucial and which is prerequisite to this entire idea. These think tanks would inculcate and promote the idea primarily, and also help devise policies for the newly created offices. And also it should be among the priorities of this newly created office to find consensus to declare this entire area a nuclear weapon free zone. This would be a big confidence building measure between these regional countries, which would help reduce presence of forces or convert their activities to disaster management and so forth. So side by side, it's very crucial for these newly created offices to devise and suggest sustainable planning and energy policy for the region. And to that end, exploring and investing in GB's hydroelectric capacity would be very crucial, not only to fulfill the basic needs of people, not only to halt the activity of tree cutting in the region, but also the surplus during peak season, the surplus electricity can be exported to nearby grids, which the resultant revenue in turn could be reinvested in viable and sustainable projects in the region. And finally, the final point of my presentation is cooperation will certainly help overcome anticipated water wars by creating innovative solutions and by mitigating threat of climate. And also, if this newly created office is interested, it can help devise a holistic solution to all these water basins. So thank you so much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to questions. And thank you so much. That's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Kashif, and thanks again, all of you, for sending questions to the Q&A box. I'm going to pass it on now to Kashun for her presentation.
Thank you, Sunena. So I've been researching on the topic revitalizing US-Pakistan economic cooperation. It's a known fact that US-Pakistan relationship has been security-centric. And over the past 2 decades, Pakistan and US relationship was pivoted largely on Afghanistan. However, US military withdrawal from Afghanistan has made one point clear: for the relationship to sustain in the long term, it must build on shared interest-based interaction. And in that context, I inquire for the brief that if economic partnership could be the next pivot for the relationship. Idealistically, yes. Realistically, not anytime soon, but a great promising opportunity there if driven by private sector. And this is not an assumption, but I build the research on a mix of quantitative and qualitative methods, such as the expert interviews, analysis of primary and secondary data, analysis of statistical data to understand the economic trends. The idea of economic cooperation between US-Pakistan is not something new. It has previously been discussed but suffered major impediments due to major constraints. For instance, as a strategic ally of US on the war on terror, Pakistan did receive economic assistance, but that economic assistance subsided as soon as the political tensions increased, directing to the fact that not economy, but geopolitics of the region at large is what shaped and dictated the relationship. And more importantly, speaking of economic assistance, it was essentially in the form of aid. And the trade dimension of that assistance was not much emphasized on, which brings me to the next point, which is that during the Obama administration, there was great interest, strong interest in Washington to build broad-based relationship with Pakistan, which included long-term economic development projects. And while it involved a large set of projects, much of it was materialized in the form of Kerry-Lugar bill, which received divided support in Pakistan. That effort failed, and it led to competing narratives of complaints both in Pakistan and in Washington. So when we heard US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman in her recent visit say that US is not looking to build broad-based relationship with Pakistan, that statement stemmed from the frustrating experience of 2009, which led to less or even no appetite to expand economic relationship with Pakistan. Fast forward today, there's increasing concerns in DC over Chinese economic presence in Pakistan, which according to some DC experts limit the investment opportunities for US firms. Apart from politics, Pakistan has not been an attractive investment destination for the investments, initially due to the security conditions and also because of the administrative hurdles such as the bureaucratic red tapes, inconsistent taxation policies, regulatory concerns, so on and so forth. So with this as the backdrop, why should we forge and vouch for an economic partnership between the two countries? Two things primarily. One, Pakistan is a potential emerging market for tech and clean energy sector. In the tech sector, US companies could capitalize and are already capitalizing on 300,000 English-speaking IT talent base, that too on competitive pricing. And this tech sector is enabled by three factors. One, tech infrastructure being built in Pakistan. Two, legislative measures being taken, such as the recently mandated Special Technology Zone bill. Third is the increasing role of Pakistani diaspora in the American business community, which are directing investments towards Pakistan. And more importantly, the IT products and the export of these products, such as semiconductors, which are of strategic importance in the US. And second area, the clean energy sector. Pakistan is an emerging market for development of solar and wind projects, and Pakistani companies like Siemens could provide infrastructure technology such as the intra-solar inverter, which are cost effective as well. Secondly, and one point that given that Pakistan and US are at a political impasse, the shift has to be driven by the private sector. Moving on to my second point, which is that the evolving strategic thinking in Washington and Pakistan enables the environment for this private sector B2B engagement. How so? One, in Pakistan, there's a shift from geopolitics to geoeconomics. Both the civil military leadership is on the same page to focus on the idea of regional integration. And second, which is trade partnerships. And secondly, in Washington, there is a focus of counterterrorism and towards Indo-Pacific region, creating opportunity for economic engagement with Pakistan. How? One, US is diversifying its economic partners, creating the opportunity to engage economically with Pakistan. And second, US is as to offset Chinese influence in the South Asian region. US is not likely to let Pakistan slip into the Chinese economic influence. So for my policy brief, I'm strongly recommending B2B engagement in the tech and clean energy sector. And for that, while there's a promising opportunity for business-to-business engagement, I'm also recommending policy measures and policy facilitation by both the administrations in both Pakistan and US. One is basically for the Pakistani policymakers, there's a need to address the political impediments to realize the geo-economic orientation. If tech cooperation is any metric, Pakistan must realize that it's playing in the bigger league. Quad players such as Japan and India are reducing their dependence on Chinese supply chains. And in order to do so, United States is allowing countries like South Korea and Vietnam to open centers of its semiconductor companies in the US. And Pakistan could also establish centers of its semiconductor companies in the US. And moreover, Quad companies are adopting standard investment reviews. And by assuming similar review protocols, Pakistan could welcome engagement from the US firms and also fend off the apprehensions of Chinese technological infiltration into Pakistan. Second, Pakistan must undertake difficult reforms. While there's already institutional overhaul taking place in Pakistan, there's a need to do much more, such as introducing more efficient and easier payment methods, reducing custom-related barriers. And third is to incentivize clean energy in Pakistan by introducing subsidies for clean energy technology, ensuring there's consumer education, training sessions for knowledge transfer, and ensuring quality control. Moreover, for the US policymakers, I recommend considering building enhanced economic cooperation with Pakistan. Contrary to the Chinese economic model, US government exercises limited role in directing independent business opportunities and business investments towards any country, but it can facilitate that process through programs such as the International Development Financial Corporation, which ensures debt financing programs of the clean energy projects. Also, initiatives such as political risk insurance help build trust of the investors, especially for countries like Pakistan, where there are concerns of circular debt and capital return. Second, US must revisit travel advisory to Pakistan, which is identified as major impediment in bringing investment to Pakistan, according to some Pakistani diaspora in the business community I've talked to. And third, US must actualize a carbon trading policy with Pakistan to promote clean energy. This is a recommendation for the short-term goal that US can finance clean energy projects in Pakistan in return for emission rights. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Happy to address questions in the Q&A section and welcome any thoughts through the email.
Thank you very much, Kashun. And again, please do keep sending any questions that come up while you're listening to these presentations in that Q&A function. Finally, I'm going to pass it on to Mohsen to give his presentation.
Thank you, Sunaina. Very good morning and good evening to the viewers. My topic is India's public diplomacy through diaspora engagement. So basically, I analyze some features, issues, and recommendations. So to start with how public diplomacy is connected to diaspora engagement. So I'll give a brief about that so that people can understand the connection right from the beginning before I move on to the discussion. So public diplomacy is basically about engagements through non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental means, so this is essentially aimed at building people-to-people ties, influencing public opinions in foreign countries in order to finally ultimately influence their government policies. So how does diaspora figure in this setting? That speaks for itself, because the diaspora's emotional attachment to their homeland comes with close lived experience and geographical proximity of living in that land actually helps them to contribute to India or for that matter any country's diplomatic endeavors. So basically the scope and context of my policy brief are the research questions that I investigate are how India's domestic politics is shaping the country's public diplomacy through diaspora engagement, and whether India's public diplomacy efforts to shape a positive image abroad will succeed. both are closely connected, and it's the study is contextualized in India's massive diaspora outreach under the current Modi government. So we have seen since 2014, Modi government has been unprecedented in its approach to diaspora engagement. It's as part of its soft power diplomacy. There have been significant efforts, both political and institutional and at policy levels. I keep that for discussion in the Q&A, the final Q&A session. So methodologically, my study relied on secondary resources, which included newspaper reports, policy reports, as well as Indian American attitude surveys. And I've also did a couple of interviews, semi-structured qualitative interviews with experts in the area, as well as organizations who are in the US. Moving on to the key arguments and findings, my study argues that while the perceived prominence of diaspora for foreign policy, economic development, and technology and skill transfer continues, there is a major trend that is becoming evident, and that is the significant reckoning of diaspora as the new public diplomats. So what does this new public diplomat means? So the new public diplomats are expected to engage their host society, political elites, and for opinion makers in that country, especially on critical matters related to foreign affairs and policies related to India. They are aimed, they are supposed to, push back against the narratives that are unfavorable to India. For that matter, there has been significant efforts to collaborate with some, US-based civil society organizations under the current government. So one example that I can give in this regard is how India's withdrawal of Article 370 played out in the diaspora. Within the US, the diaspora was deeply divided, and there was, congressional briefing by US-based civil society organizations, Indo-American community federations, and Kashmir overseas associations. So that was the collaboration between the governmental, the civil society organizations who are within the US. But despite so many efforts, what is happening is India's public diplomacy through diaspora finds itself in a contested sphere of persuasive influence, wherein actors are divided along strong partisan and ideological rationales, and they are challenging each other's view through competing narratives. So consequently, we have deeply fragmented narratives coming out on certain policies of India instead of a cohesive narrative that could actually project a positive image about India's democratic credentials as well as India's values abroad. Moving on to the certain issues, as I already mentioned, the space is contested, and we have different narratives and challenges emerging from within the diaspora abroad. So these can be understood within these three dimensions. So first is representation. So it basically denotes standing for the country and representing its traditions and culture and policies. So there have been various engagements and efforts directed at building people-to-people relations and also to tell India's story. However, projecting Indian values abroad have very recently become contentious when efforts to that end gets immediately and closely identified with the political party or groups or partisan groups that are projecting it. So in that space, what we see is even cultural diplomacy has been seen by many as political efforts to hide the face of religious majoritarian politics in the home country. So that keeps it diaspora deeply divided along different ideological and political rationales. So moving on to the second one, which is about communication. So communication basically refers to communicating with publics and political elites in foreign countries. So this is again aimed at informing and influencing their opinions, as I rightly mentioned at the beginning of talking about the title. So the involvement of ideology to the forefront of any sort of analysis is something that I could find in my research. So what we see is very contentious campaigns and adversarial advocacy from the diaspora. For example, India's narratives on Kashmir and CAA. So both policies have been deeply contested within the diaspora. There have been diaspora one section which supports and the other section which actually contests the government's policies. So the involvement of ideology to the forefront of policy analysis actually shows that from a dominant India-Pakistan issue that the Article 370 had been, its withdrawal in 2019 actually generated narratives on how the current government is changing the only Muslim majority state in India. So this actually indicates how the discussion of any policy or any sort of analysis about India's policies have been understood through certain ideological prisms or any political and the religious connotations that are associated with the domestic politics of the the ruling party. And finally, what all this leads to is a sort of negotiations which are happening within the diaspora about the Indian national identity. So instead of projecting a unified positive country image abroad, they themselves have to negotiate their association with India and its policies based on a spectrum of considerations that are deeply embedded into the identity politics of their home country. So as a concluding remark, I have some recommendations that I've listed out. So to start with, I advise some form of restricted long-distance nationalism. Long-distance nationalism has been part of many countries for a long time, and it actually contributes to some extent in terms of engaging with the diaspora. But very recently, a couple of other incidents like restricting diaspora's movement into India on through OCI card amendment, especially in the case of US and other countries. So that actually affects the kind of engagement that India actually wants to have with diaspora. I think we can discuss that later in the discussion session. And the second one is little bit circumspection about avoid troubling diaspora with loyalty questions, and loyalty questions have been part of any diaspora, mostly in within the US and also to a certain extent in the UK and other parts of the country, other parts of the globe. So this is something that we should be very careful about. And thirdly, reduce toxic polarization in India and abroad. So this is closely connected as within a transnational public space like social media. It can actually go, it can transcend any sort of toxic polarization, can easily transcend to, internationally. So fourth, uphold democratic liberal values. This is very important given we have to, target the younger generations among the diaspora. And finally, I advise legislation on misinformation and fake news in India. Although we have some policies which are related to or which can curb misinformation and fake news, we do not have a specific policy to deal with that. So that would be very useful exercise in legislation for India. And thank you. Looking forward to the discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mohsen. We're now going to get to the audience questions component of this presentation. Thank you to all of you who have sent questions already. I'll sort of start in the order in which they came, but address a bit equitably among all of the fellows. But please do, especially as the conversation develops, continue sending any questions that you come up with. But I'll start with a question for Jyotsna, which is that would India and the US consider joining the Cptpp? So unlike the RCEP, there is no China, and it seems like it could potentially be a better bet. So this is, again, the comprehensive and progressive agreement for the Trans-Pacific, a trade agreement, if you would mind just addressing that question.
So thank you for a really interesting range of questions that I've received on the Quad. Yes, so on the Cptpp, what has happened now is that China has actually sent in an application to join the organization. So we face an issue which we were facing with RCEP. We don't want to join an organization that has a very dominant China in there, but it is going to be difficult for the Chinese to join Cptpp because there are issues with the Australian trade weaponization, and Japan is also considering whether or not to include China in the group. But also, I think trade in general has now, especially under the Biden administration, been pushed by the Indian government towards the US side. And there are talks about a mini US-India trade deal. However, what we have been hearing from our discussions with experts in the last few days, the Biden administration this time has not been as keen as the Trump administration was on the trade issue with India. So one, on the Cptpp question, I think India would be watching whether China is indeed accepted into the organization, but just generally, India has been pushing for a mini trade deal of sorts with the United States. And it is important for these countries to just recognize that as far as the security element of the Indo-Pacific is concerned, they have been working, but the economic element still sort of remains quite missing from the arrangement. So Naina, should I answer the other questions as well, or?
We'll get to them, I think, just to divide them each by question. Thank you, though, Jyotsna. I have a question now for Kashif, which is that given that there are very few water agreements between China and South Asian countries, how is this likely to complicate the story that you presented to us or lead to potential conflict?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And sorry for, my internet is a little unstable. So yeah, China has no agreement with South Asian nations, and the potential for conflict in future is no one can say certainly about this thing. But what we can say is we don't have any historical evidence where China has forced its will, especially given China's geo-economic push in the globe, its soft power diplomacy. Chances are rare that such a thing would happen in the future. But what South Asian nations can do, given China's upper riparian natural advantage and given its advantage vis-a-vis technologies and creative solutions to depleting water resources, South Asian nations should initiate steps to cooperate with China to mitigate future impacts of climate change and also conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashif. I'm going to have a question for Mohsen that I'm going to combine a little bit, but you've talked a lot about the role that the the American Indian population plays, or Indian American rather, population plays in affecting Indian public diplomacy. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more concretely to the types of influence that Indian Americans have over the domestic political situation in India, sort of speak a little bit more to the formal ties between those two components.
Okay, so basically, we can always connect, how diaspora politics affects both the countries home country as well as their host country. But in the case of India, one thing that is new is that diaspora engagement, public diplomacy under the current government has been since beginning both external and internal oriented. So whatever the government does is being projected outside the country, especially to the diaspora and abroad. That's another way of connecting, the domestic outside. So that's our own citizens outside are also being drawn into our own domestic politics and giving them some sort of, feeling of being part of the domestic politics or whatever is going inside the country. So this was something that was missing earlier in under various governments under Congress or other coalitions. So that's something that's very important. And how it is, what was the second part of the question? I missed, I think.
If you could just speak to some of the formal channels or manners in which the Indian American community affects the situation.
So there are a couple of incidents. There are a couple of instances where Indian American community was very, proved to be very beneficial to India's foreign policy. And one was obviously, the nuclear deal, which was started in 2005 and then signed later on. So during that time, there was a lot of push from the Indian diaspora to forge, not only close ties with the US, but also to make that nuclear doctrine or these connections. So that was one thing, and the very recent example that we can see is during the COVID-19 situation in India. While India was struggling under COVID situation, and the US was little late or reluctant to supply medical or other supports, the role of diaspora is said to be like prominent in pushing the government, their own government, to reach out to India with medical supplies. So I think there could be different ways in which diaspora actually influence. Some certain occasion could be subtle, or on certain level it could be prominent. So in the policies that I mentioned, CAA and other, they were very active, support from one side, and there was very active opposition from the other side. Unlike the other occasions that I mentioned, like nuclear deal or COVID-19, there was a unified effort from the diaspora. So this is exactly what I aim at. If there is a unified effort from diaspora, that is likely to get executed. But if the diaspora is divided along partisan and ideological levels on matters related to India's foreign policy or domestic politics, that's likely to affect how India wants to project its own narrative or its own story. So I think these are the few ways where the dynamics of diaspora with public diplomacy and the domestic politics interact.
Thank you, Mohsen. I have a question for Kashun, which is that in international political thinking, China is very much seen as the primary economic partner of Pakistan. So given that situation and given existing geopolitical dynamics in the region, how would you incentivize Pakistan to continue cooperating with the United States, given this developing relationship with China?
Thank you, Sunaina, for this question. And yes, I've addressed this in my presentation as well, that since US-Pakistan relationship was very centric on the geopolitics of the region, the economic cooperation was neglected. And this is what I'm arguing that Pakistan and US should shift away from. The geopolitics considerations of the region is what, yes, will shape the relationship in the future. But there's also, the point is for the private sector to drive the economic cooperation. And that has to happen through the reforms, domestic reforms that take place in Pakistan. Some of it has already taken place, has already started in the form of the institutional and overall measures which are being taken place, such as the facilitation, which is there's already an engagement with the Pakistani diaspora in the US. For instance, there's this DeFi Venture, which is a VC venture capital company in the US that made an investment of 30 billion in Bazaar, which is a B2B market, retail marketplace. And that sort of investment was facilitated by a Pakistani entrepreneur. So that's the kind of engagement that we need to push on, which is the private sector. In Pakistan, the Pakistani government can only incentivize it through facilitation, such as the legislative measures. The STCA bill that I pointed out in my presentation is excellent in a sense that it's addressing the issue and the concerns over the data protection laws. So what they're trying to bring in is because much of the apprehensions were on the Chinese technological infiltration in Pakistan. That's what fended the US firms from coming into Pakistan. So measures and such as these data protection laws fend off these apprehensions. They clear these concerns. So one is these legislative measures. Two are the facilitations, institutional facilitations by the Pakistani government. So it has to happen through the reforms, the facilitation, but much of it has to be pushed by the private sector.
Thank you, Kashun. I have another question for Jyotsna, which is India satisfied with the US Quad participation in the Information Fusion Center in the Indian Ocean region? What more does India want to improve their MDA?
So on MDA, like I said, I think there is scope to expand how we look at the MDA and include various stakeholders who look at MDA from the perspective of fisheries, maritime security, because we've had, just like the United States, cases of maritime terrorism, especially vis-a-vis the Mumbai attacks. As far as the fusion center is concerned, India has placed liaison officers from the neighboring countries at the fusion center in Gurgaon. Because it's important to include these countries when we have discussions on the MDA. Specifically, as far as technologies are concerned, I think there are discussions on space-based technologies. Perhaps the space agencies of the Quad countries could work together on this. And there are discussions on moving from single dimension to multi-dimensional approach to MDA. Again, this brings the question of sort of undersea domain awareness. US and India have worked on this already. Indian Navy inducted the Sea Guardian drones from the US, and that has helped achieve greater coverage of the littorals surrounding India. But perhaps the Quad countries could work on undersea sensor technologies, especially in the Indian Ocean region. Another partner could be France here, which has influence in the southwestern Indian Ocean. Here, the Quad could perhaps work out an arrangement to work with the Indian Ocean Commission, which is a body based out of that region in the Southwest Indian Ocean, to achieve sort of greater operational synergies with the island countries and with France in that region.
I have a quick follow-up question for you, Jyotsna, and then I will go to a follow-up question on what you just said, Kashun. So what impact, given what you just said, do different definitions of the Indian Ocean region from within Quad countries, how does that affect their cooperation? And is there any prospect for an agreement on how we delineate the Indian Ocean region?
I think earlier there were discussions on how the Western Indian Ocean was a largely neglected area. But I think increasingly we're seeing more exercises focusing on that region, and the Indo-Pacific concept, in fact, just being expanded to include that region that stretches all the way to Eastern Africa. So we are already seeing greater synergies in that idea of how we look at the Indian Ocean region. So these discussions were happening in 2017. So we've already come a long way from that.
Thank you, Jyotsna. And then for Kashun, so I have a question that is basically saying that the private sector already is under a lot of the influence of the PRC. So given that, how will your arrangement work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It really depends on which sector you're looking at. So such concerns stem from the China-Pakistan economic corridor already in place in Pakistan. And if you look at the 2020-2021 foreign direct investment that came into Pakistan, so the FDI from China is 41% compared to 8% from US. And the US 2021 investment climate statement says that these the tilt is because of the CPAC projects, which only allowed PRC approved companies to bid on. So these are only the CPAC projects that you're talking about. But compared to that, if you're talking about the private sector, which is tech-driven, the tech-focused private sector, I've just mentioned how Bazaar got a 30 billion investment from DeFi Venture, and also Curl & Perkins also made their first investment into Pakistan of 17 billion into Tajir, which is a tech-enabled retail network. So these the tech sector is already, is an attractive destination for the venture capitalist based in the US. More importantly, if we talk about the IT exports, such as the semiconductors, these are of strategic importance in the US. That's also, these exports are also taking place. In fact, Pakistan IT exports grew by 47%, and half of the IT outsourced services were to the US. So it just depends on the kind of sector that you're looking at. And while I'm saying that, I will also stress that the policy recommendation that I mentioned earlier, that US must focus on economic engagement with Pakistan, be it through the facilitation of the private sector. Programs such as the developmental financial corporations actually do financing of clean energy projects in Pakistan that could, stop it from being PRC approved projects. So, I mean, comparative advantage in the sectors, finding comparative advantage in the sectors that US could capitalize on.
Thank you, Kashun. So I have a question for Kashif. So in recent years, Pakistan has taken steps towards formally mainstreaming Gilgit-Baltistan as a standalone province. How is that step to go forward, and what would the impact be on the climate and conflict dynamics that you just detailed?
Yeah, good question, and thank you for the question. Gilgit-Baltistan, Pakistan has not recently, but from quite long has been trying to incorporate Gilgit-Baltistan into mainstream Pakistan. But post India annexation of Kashmir, this push has been, accentuated by higher ups in Pakistan's policy making, and there are lobbies which say that this would, affect Pakistan's cause in the international cause, Kashmir's international cause in the United Nations, and these things, stop Pakistan from incorporating Gilgit-Baltistan, declaring it its provisional province, not full province. But again, it would certainly, affect a holistic approach, which it would affect my idea, which I gave, to declare this entire area a global environmental park. But my question is, if Pakistan, declares Gilgit-Baltistan a province, would it force India to, give up its stance from Kashmir? No, it would not. So things will escalate further by this. So only silver lining which I predict which I anticipate is that the authority must be given to indigenous, because after all, for decades, 7 decades, international community and regional countries are failed to reach to any solution to this vital region, which is rich in natural resources, especially water. So there need a solution. There is a need. There is a need of solution. There is need of out of the box approach to this, and for that, locals and indigenous must be empowered, and a holistic, so that a holistic, solution comes out.
Thanks very much, Kashif. So I have another question for Jyotsna. So there is a Western Quad emerging with the India and US also as member states. Does this pose an obstacle to the strengthening of the alliance of the India, US, Japan, Australia Quad?
I think primarily that's actually a really interesting question. This shows the complementarities increasingly of US and Indian foreign policy. One of the defining features of Indian foreign policy under Prime Minister Modi has been that of multi-alignment. So there is a move away from that focus on non-alignment to a more open approach where you're seeking interest-based coalitions. And we've seen in the last few years, India develop its relations strategic partnerships with the bloc that includes Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, and the Abraham Accords have helped with this greatly. I think the focus of the Western Quad is more towards investment, energy sector, counter-terrorism, and connectivity. So I think this is like just a natural conclusion of what has been happening the last few years, where we have developed strategic partnerships with these countries and moved away from Iran in that sense. However, having said that, we are now waiting for the new Iranian foreign minister to come to New Delhi in a few days, and the discussions are to do with the Chabahar port. But that is to do with India having a route to access Afghanistan to deliver humanitarian aid, because we've seen Pakistan saying no to Indian aid being allowed to reach Afghanistan via land routes. So that discussion has started again. But overall, I think the Indian shift has been towards the Gulf countries, which include the UAE, Saudi, and Israel as well.
If I can pair that, Jyotsna, with a very quick follow-up, if you could just keep your answer brief to this, but how then would the Quad operate also institutionally with ASEAN?
So all Quad countries have repeatedly said that they, in their articulation of the Indo-Pacific concept, that ASEAN is central to the Indo-Pacific idea. And it's important to remember that the earlier Quad meetings actually happened on the sidelines of the ASEAN Regional Forum meetings. So the Quad has worked in that sense with ASEAN, but it is difficult to say that the Quad will be working at some sort of an institutional level with ASEAN, because as far as the ASEAN approach towards Indo-Pacific is concerned, it's a lot more broad-based. I think the Quad countries would find it much easier to work on a bilateral or trilateral basis, be it in naval cooperation or dialogues of some form, to look at the various deliverables that I discussed with countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, than with ASEAN on the whole. Having said that, they'll just be discussions, but I think the real meat would lie in these bilateral or trilateral discussions with ASEAN members.
Thanks so much, Jyotsna. Now for Mohsen, you've talked a lot about the Indian American diaspora community, but could you speak a little bit more to the role of the Indian diaspora in other parts of the world? There's a massive diaspora population in the Gulf, for instance. And then a second question paired with that is just, then what issues could the Indian government use to unite the fragmented diaspora?
Yeah. So regarding the role of Indian diaspora in the Gulf, I think it's very restricted, because the Gulf population, there is no citizenship. So that itself curtails any form of political activism in the Gulf countries. So the role for Indian diaspora in the Gulf is basically to maintain that historical connection, people to people ties, which India can benefit as we are trying to expand our horizons, in terms of cooperation with the Gulf countries in the coming days. So that's one thing that India can do. Actually, maintaining people to people ties is very important. That for one instance, we can see in the case of huge flood in Kerala, the Gulf countries were reaching out to the particular location in Kerala. That it's because of the people-to-people connection that has established for them to feel some sort of relational solidarity with the people of that that part of the country. So that's one way of doing it. And another way, obviously, our Prime Minister has been very forthcoming in engaging the Gulf, and he has expanded our relations beyond security or beyond trade of oil trade. So now we are focusing on terrorism, we are focusing on security and a whole lot of other issues. So in that way, I think this would contribute to a certain extent, but not politically so much, because as I mentioned earlier, that the political activism within the Gulf countries is to a great extent restricted. And the second one was regarding Indian-American.
It's regarding what the Indian government can do to help unite and these sort of fragmented diaspora perspectives.
Yeah, I think it starts from home. I think, but what is happening abroad is sort of a reflection of what is happening within the country. So I think obviously it should start from political willingness from all the parties who are involved in playing identity politics and depolarization. And one thing that the government actually can do is apart from keeping away from these kind of politics, the government can actually bring in some sort of law, as I mentioned in the my recommendation. One of the recommendations was about bringing a specific law that can actually deal with misinformation and fake news. From my talk with one of the experts, so I was told that one thing, a platform where the diaspora actually gets a lot of news about India is through social media, and that's not surprising given that social media has been like very contested space across the world, and misinformation has lately become very significant issue even in politics or other relations in society. So this is something that actually the government could do, and I hope the government does it. So that I think these are the basic points that the government can actually focus on.
Thank you, Mohsen. I have a question for Kashun. So, of course, with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in August and the Taliban takeover, there's been a massive humanitarian crisis as well as potential spillover into Pakistan. What does that potential insecurity, what could that mean for prospects for US-Pakistan trade or economic cooperation? And of course, you talked in your presentation about the security dimension to US-Pakistan relations. Is that likely to subside given the ongoing situation in Afghanistan?
Yeah, in the short term, the politics may trump over the economic relationship, especially given that we had the Afghanistan congressional hearings on Afghanistan, in which Pakistan found a tough position at. And also the Pakistan review is coming up, which again, questions raised on cooperation with Pakistan, be it security or economic. So these such political considerations will find their way in. We cannot deny that fact. But also, as you just mentioned, the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Afghanistan and the business opportunities, as some people have identified, so analysts have identified, so creates an opportunity such as the Quad platform that United States during the withdrawal established, which is United States, Pakistan, China, and Uzbekistan, is to basically create economic opportunities in Afghanistan, facilitated by Pakistan and the Quad countries, could be a good platform to ensure that the spillover is not happening in Pakistan, and also there's no collapse of the Afghan economy itself. And second, primarily, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Kashun. And now a question for Kashif, which is that many of your policy proposals are focused on the general security situation in Gilgit-Baltistan, but of course your topic is so much about how naturally occurring or natural disasters or climate-induced threats pose more of a challenge or exacerbate existing security challenges. Could you speak to how some of your solutions are going to address the immediate environmental impact of these natural disaster challenges, and how your solutions will address that in addition to simply the security dimension? So effectively, how are think tanks in Gilgit-Baltistan, which you mentioned as one of your points, how is that going to address some of the underlying climate-induced threats?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And first of all, I want to, inculcate this thing that there are no or few think tanks in Gilgit-Baltistan. So that brings the need of think tanks, for especially for climate security, climate action. And that's why I'm suggesting this thing, that think tanks are prerequisite to this entire idea. And I also I'm not overemphasizing on security or conflict resolution, but yes, conflict resolution is prerequisite to climate action. Given the volatile security situation and given the disputed nature of these mountain territories, I claim that I also argue that any individual, bilateral, or joint action to tackle climate without taking into consideration the more imminent threat of conflict to work on conflict resolution prove to be futile. So that's why I'm focusing more on that. And of course, simultaneously and side by side, what I'm emphasizing is to work on a sustainable development policy for the region, especially energy policy, which would get rid of climate hazards, and also which would help fulfill basic needs of the people of the region. So basic need is of think tanks, which would help devise these policies, help which would identify where and when it is needed to take an action. And you would be surprised to know that many times the annual budget of Gilgit-Baltistan has not fully been utilized because of lack of a policy. So that's why we need these policy institutes at the very basic level, and then we can build on it gradually. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashif. And now a question for Jyotsna. There are two tensions of sorts in the deliverables that you speak of, because you talk about non-defense and security deliverables and you talk about defense and security specific deliverables. But what incentive does the Quad have, if not for the China threat, which you talk about that being the primary thing that has brought these four countries together? If you transcend thinking about it purely in defense and security manner, what compels these countries together to cooperate on issues that are not defense and security related?
So even if these deliverables might not be defense and security related in a very explicit sense, like I said, there's still something to do with China there. So from the vaccine initiative, we've seen how when these countries were distributing vaccines to other countries, there was a competition of sorts, and there were discussions of how perhaps China would send vaccines to countries that recognize Taiwan in exchange for them to switch recognition to PRC. So the incentive here is for these countries, for the Quad countries, to compete with China on gaining that kind of an influence, and perhaps canceling that sort of geopolitical influence that China is seeking in return of its vaccine diplomacy. If we look at the conversation on the text side of things, again, it has to do with China. Like I pointed out, standards. China has been the country which has contributed to the most as far as international tech standards are considered. So the Quad countries are having a discussion on how technology design and use and development should comply with democratic standards at least to a very basic level. China, of course, has a first mover advantage here because many of these technologies have been developed by China. So now it's for the Quad countries and other partners such as the T10 and D10 to work with Quad on presenting an alternative. And same goes for issues like connectivity. It's about India, Japan, especially working together in the Eastern African littoral states to provide infrastructure. India has a lot of experience in those countries. Japan brings the money. So it's about providing quality infrastructure where China already has a lot of, where China is already competing for influence. So I think it always traces back to the China question.
I have another question for Kashun, which is that with other East Asian states, so Taiwan and South Korea have the technology to produce the thinnest chips. So what is Pakistan's comparative advantage, especially considering other offerings from countries in East Asia?
Yeah, again, emphasizing the need to institute a robust technological sector in Pakistan. And given that it's just taking a flight, we cannot expect it to have the same capacity as other Southeast Asian countries, which are already in the game, which is why I recommended that Pakistan needs to realize that it's playing in the bigger league when thinking of the tech cooperation, but also thinking about the thinnest chips that the question came up. Pakistan have already semiconductor companies that are doing, these companies have sale revenues of worth $250 million. So there is some sort of comparative advantage that Pakistan is placed at. There's how do Pakistan really capitalizes on that sector and really becomes an exporter such as South Korea and other ASEAN countries. And again, South Korea also is a country that started from zero, and Pakistan is a country which is taking a flight in that direction. So a good start would be to mandate domestic reforms, economic reforms, and institute technological facilitation at home.
Thank you, Kashun. So I'm cognizant of time and that we're coming to the end of the allotted time for this. So I just wanted to ask a final question, and all fellows, if you would answer in about no more than 30 seconds to this question. But if you could articulate the most important takeaway that your research has for the region, given conversations you've had, given what you've already addressed in comments and in your presentations, we will end on that note. And I'll start with Mohsen.
So my topic was, based on a very topical issue. So I think it right away connects with the politics both in India and abroad. So in that sense, I think this is something that we have to, incorporate in, the government's policies, because this is very critical, given that, there are different narratives about how India as a rising power is not able to rise up to certain expectations. So I think this is one area where we can actually improve upon, and there is a lot of scope for improvement, given if we can make, given if the government can make certain changes in the way we look at diaspora. So I think, yeah.
Thanks, Mohsen. Now, Kashun.
Yeah, so the takeaway from my presentation and this session at large would be, one, the shift from geopolitics to geoeconomics should not be neglected, which is taking place in Pakistan, which drives the need to have economic cooperation between Pakistan and US. This cooperation, which is on point basis, will not sustain in the long term. So there's a need to have a shared interest-based relationship. And two, moving on to the private sector, that the shift has to be driven by the private sector, and there's a huge promising opportunity for that. Just picking up from Kashif's presentation, how climate change is unfolding as a existential threat in South Asia. Both the Biden administration and the Khan administration identify climate change as national security threats, so it's identified as high priority. And during my research and talk with the representatives from the State Department, they mentioned climate change as high priority area interest area for Washington to engage with Pakistan on. So a huge potential for tech clean energy solutions, tech-driven solutions for clean energy. And third is, if I could connect with Joshna's presentation, the Indo-Pacific region, we must realize that Indo-Pacific is very much relevant for Pakistan as well. And, banking on the questions that also came up, if tech cooperation is any metric, Pakistan has to remain cognizant of the Quad politics in play and must not only look west, but also look east.
Thank you, Kashun. Now, briefly, Jyotsna, and then after Jyotsna, Kashif.
Right. I would just say that I think we're long past the time when we were under the illusion that the Quad's more of a talking shop. We have seen a lot of development in the last few months itself. But having said that, in my policy brief, I've only signposted towards potential areas of cooperation that emerge in the near future. But we're going to see the Quad agenda evolve quite rapidly and also widely. That's because these countries are learning to work together on a range of issues.
Thanks so much, Jyotsna. And then finally, Kashif.
Yeah, I would say that my idea might seem overly optimistic given regional geostrategic situation, the volatile situation, but technically evading a conflict, evading these disputes is possible, but consequences and threats of climate in the medium to long term are not. So rationality demands, a joint action to tackle these long term climate threats, and in order to make them less, they're less worse. And there is a need, given inability of regional and global powers to dilute these disputes. There is a need to indigenize this whole thing, and there is a need to take this thing as a cause. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kashif. So I'm aware that we are over time at this point, but I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of our fellows. It's been a real pleasure to work with you for the past 9 months. And I'm very excited to see where the policy memos develop from here. For anyone watching and anyone asking questions, thank you so much for tuning in. I would highly encourage you to keep up with South Asian Voices. The fellows are regularly contributing pieces to that, many of which are relevant to their policy memos, and then to stay tuned for those memos in published form over the next few months. But thank you, everyone. And with that,